Hi booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be giving you a bit of a random reading update, going through what I've read so far this month. So far I've finished 4 books, and most of it's poetry and there's one work of non-fiction. The first book that I'll bring up, I don't have too much to say necessarily. I did really enjoy it, but I think I've at least mentioned it over the last few wrap-ups and updates and things, and really I don't have much more to say rather than to recommend it and then to read some of the poems to you, which I'll try to do in a Poetry Thursday at some point. But it's George Szirtes' new and collected poems, and he's just a fantastic poet, often very formal but not in a flowery way. Instead he's it seems like he's really internalized the forms and they just come out naturally. It feels like a natural sort of form of expression for him, which is lovely to see. Often dealing with memory and the way that history, the sort of larger narrative of history, interrupts human life and is interwoven with human life. He was born in Hungary, and then when he was a young child, after the uprising in Hungary in the 50s, his family moved to the UK. So there are a fair few poems in here about his early memories of Britain and of I suppose trying to fit in and feeling different and this strange new world that they found themselves in. And then later in life he goes back to Hungary and starts unweaving his history in just a really beautiful way. And I'll try to see if there are any poems. Some of his poems, particularly as he sort of reaches his sort of middle period, start getting quite long, and there are these really long but beautiful sort of sequences of poems that all sort of weave in and out of each other. The best of them is a poem called the Photographer in Winter, which is about his mother, I think, as a younger woman, and it's just wonderful. And there's a lovely one in here called Meeting Austerlitz, which is essentially about W.G. Sebald, and Szirtes worked at the University of East Anglia, which is I think where Sebald taught German as well, and so was a professor of German. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they knew each other quite well. So that was George Szirtes' new and collected poems. And then on to another poetry collection, one that I hauled recently. I was just quite excited to get to it. And it's Giant Moth Perishes by Geoffrey Nutter. And again, not too much to say about this other than it's just lovely. There's an immediacy to his poems, and I don't know whether we would call it generosity, but there's a sense of the surreal and of finding various images and random or seemingly random subject matters and throwing them all together in this, and so it's a different kind of poetry to the kind that Szirtes writes, and yet I enjoyed it very much, and it reminds me of what was I going to say? Yeah, it does actually remind me of John Ashbery a little bit, but not quite as obtuse as John Ashbery. And I'm just sort of flicking through to see if there's one that stands out to me that I could read to you. But ultimately, it's just a collection that just made me feel good to be reading. And it's definitely a book I'll be going back to, I think, when I want a kind of pick-me-up book, I think. So I'll read one, I think, appropriate for booktube, called What Happens to the World When You Close a Book. What happens to the world when you close a book? We have to doubt everything we feel, and so we are here in the 21st century, writing poems. We have to suspect parody, yet the earth is a cool ceramic ball, and we resolve pellucid in the sun, while the icy cucumber and the warm-blooded eggplant ripen. And we must also be carpenters from birth, for we are living in the homes that we constructed. Circular walls, or walls with circular breezeways, at the end of which rises a view of the sea. And you can be equally divided between those places, or several more. And there are blocks of houses shut off from one another by a wall of ferns. But you can walk through rooms. You might have been in one. You might have been in once, and they're shut off from one another too. We were taught to fear nothing, but a protective shell made of crystal builds around you a fragile reticence, and as siege machinery to centipede is metaphor for mind or its strange vacancy, its harmony ensues, is calmed. Interlocking hallways wind through the interiors of buildings, and you are reclining in sunbeams. So, yeah, I think he's trying to describe the mind there. You can be the judge as to how successfully, but yeah, just sort of brimming with life and often a sense of compassion. It seems like there are quite a few poems in there that are written to friends and to family members, to his daughter, to I assume his spouse and other people like that. And it's not the kind of poetry necessarily where he's alluding to some event that's happened between them and that's the crux of the poem necessarily. But he's trying to work at something special, I think, and trying to find a detail that would resonate with them and then hopefully with the reader. That's the impression I got from it, and I'll be going back to it at some point to read again. And then let's see if I can get the cover up for you. I was aware that the year was rolling on, and I hadn't read much for Historathon, which is a year-long reading event championed by Vin from Revenant Reads, where you read non-fiction history through the year, and you read different periods of history in the different quarters of the year. And at this point of the year, in the first 3 months, we're reading sort of ancient history. And if I can get the cover up, nope, I've opened a random book. I've randomly opened up Marcus Aurelius, and we don't want any. You don't want any Marcus Aurelius, at least not today. I read Ghost on the Throne by James Romm. Hope you can see it there on the Kindle. And it's a story, or it's telling the story of what happened to Alexander the Great's empire after he died. And actually through this, because I suppose you can't just tell that story, so you do get a fair bit of Alexander's life as well. But it's looking at many of the bodyguards and generals and officials who were left behind, and there was no clear hierarchy there. He had bodyguards, but he hadn't set a specific second in command or anything like that. And so then he dies, relatively young and unexpectedly, and no one knows what to do. There's this one bodyguard, and I'm warning you that I will be mispronouncing probably all of the names. But there's this one bodyguard called Perkidas or Perkidas. Perkidas sounds good. We'll go with Perkidas, and he's been given Alexander's signet ring. So there's a certain amount of authority, and he's trying to hold some semblance of government together and work out what to do, work out some kind of ascendancy. There's all kinds of complications to do with the succession to the throne. There's two possibilities. There's Alexander's, I'm trying to remember if it's his, I think it's basically his brother, if I'm remembering correctly. It's his half-brother, who was born with some kind of developmental condition. He was, some people would say mentally handicapped. Something like that is what people think nowadays. And so it was essentially more like developmentally like a child than an adult. And so some people wouldn't have felt too comfortable with him being the king with that much responsibility and having to make all these decisions. Surely for some other people that's a welcome sign. He's an easy person to manipulate and things like that. So there's all that going on. But also then there's, what about an heir to Alexander? And would that be a better person to I've forgotten the word, to ascend the throne, to succeed? Yeah, I suppose that's where succession comes from. And so one of Alexander's wives, and as emperor, he had he was the only person in the empire who was allowed to be polygamous. So he had tons of wives, and with one of his wives, who was from Central Europe, I'm trying to remember her name, but yeah, she was from Central Europe. So, and I should say that the Macedonians were pretty snobby and quite an in crowd, and they even looked down on the Greeks. And so the idea of adopting Persian fashions in the way that Alexander was doing, and the idea of taking wives from Central Europe and from Central Asia, from places that are probably now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, places like that, was unthinkable to them. And yet one of his wives from that area had given him a son, who is later named Alexander. So we've got Alexander the Second, I suppose, and then his brother, who is called Philip, which is also confusing because their father was called Philip. So there's lots of these names going around. And yeah, she's pregnant, and he gives birth not long after Alexander has died, and it's a boy. And so we've got Alexander the Second and Philip, two claimants to the throne. People squabble over this, and eventually through some diplomacy, they come up with this idea for a sort of dual monarchy between the two, and various, Alexander's mother and the mother of Alexander the Second are all there in the background, as well as a woman from the Macedonian royal family, I believe, who's married Philip, Alexander's brother, and so she's already just in the royal house, you might say. There's all these kinds of squabbles, and then there's all the generals and the bodyguards who all have their armies, and essentially there's Perdiccas's side, there is Antipater's side, who has this fearsome sort of old-time general with him called Antigones. I think it's Antigones or Antigonus. I think there's an Antigonus and an Antigones, which is very confusing as well. But I think they were both on the same side, so I'll just say Antigonus. So there's them, and then there's also Ptolemy. He's the only one who'd probably resonate, at least with me, and I presume with a lot of other people who don't know too much about the Macedonians. Ptolemy goes down to Egypt, takes over Egypt, and one of the things I found quite funny, he goes up into Palestine, Syria, places like that, and he goes to Jerusalem, and he's been doing his homework, and he's found out that these people, the Jews, have this special day where they don't do anything, and they're not even allowed to fight. So he's like, we'll just attack them on that day, and just walks into Jerusalem, walks into the temple, and that's that. And that's how the Macedonians, conquered Judea and Palestine, and all of that neck of the woods. Anyways, he's got that nice crescent from sort of Syria all the way down across to Egypt, and doing quite well, minding his own business. He also manages to steal Alexander's body, and the idea of it's called the ghost on the throne, and the presence of Alexander after he's died is actually quite important, and either the presence of his body or some kind of representation of his presence, and he's almost like a kind of messianic sort of central figure to some kind of cult. It's a personality cult essentially around Alexander, even after he's died, and so Ptolemy manages to steal Alexander's body. Alexander wanted to be buried in Egypt at this random shrine, and the Macedonians were like, nope, that's not a good idea at all. You should be buried in the royal city, in the royal tomb. And eventually Perkidas agrees with them. He wanted to follow through as many of Alexander's wishes as possible, but eventually he's worn down, and he agrees to take Alexander's body back to Macedon. And essentially, when the people taking his body are, and he has this really big, impressive hearse, essentially made of gold, and when everyone's looking the wrong way, Ptolemy's folks just go and steal the hearse and run away as quickly as they can back to Egypt. And Perkidas is just like, well, I suppose I can't do anything about that now. So they don't have Alexander's body, and so there's all this civil war going on for who should have control. Alexander had gone very far east, and a lot of the people in Babylon and things like that are basically just taking care of things themselves. All these satraps are just looking after their own city, making sure things are going smoothly there, and not worrying too much about anything else. And essentially, Perkidas's side have to split, and Perkidas decides to go down to Egypt after Ptolemy, I suppose, to try and get Alexander's body back. And he has to leave some kind of second in command to manage his armies in sort of Cappadocia and Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. And so he has this guy who is, I think, the most impressive figure in the whole book, called Eumenes. And Eumenes was Greek, and so everyone around him is really snobby about him because he's not Macedonian. And he'd been a scribe. He'd just been, I think, in charge of the treasury or something like that. But then, essentially, to put someone in place, Alexander had put Eumenes in charge of a cavalry unit, and through luck, he did quite well. He had, little or no military training, but he managed to do well. He seemed to be someone who was quite good at shifting to various situations, and he had the gift of the gab. He was able to persuade people and get out of tricky situations, which comes in handy for him because he gets in quite a few. and he's basically Perkidas's second in command. So he's left alone while Perkidas goes down to Egypt and is eventually actually murdered by some of his own men after things go terribly wrong for them in Egypt. All the while, Eumenes does really, really well. Manages, I think, to kill 2 of the most feared generals on the opposing side. Manages to win sort of more men. He sort of grows his army through defeating the enemy, and so he's got one of the largest armies, and he's managed to get himself out of this terrible situation where he's been left alone. However, he's also really angered the other side because he's killed 2 of their most favoured generals. And then eventually he sees that he's in a terrible situation because Perkidas, his has been killed, and so he's absolutely on his own. He's just that guy. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to really be doing this, and he is stuck with essentially being on the side that's trying to fulfill Alexander's wishes and at least hold something of his vision in step. Essentially he needs to find a way to keep his men in check and keep them with him. And the way he does that, he doesn't have the body of Alexander, but he's still got his armour, he's still got his tent, and he's still got his throne. And so what he does is he puts the armour on the throne as if Alexander was sort of still there, and that's the ghost on the throne. And they have this sort of ceremony in the tent, and it's this thing that he does with the silver shields with Alexander's crack soldiers, and it sort of keeps them in check. And I'm just going to see if I can find a good quotation. And it'll give you a bit of a taste of Romm's writing as well. So he's put the throne there, and Eumenes has assured them that Alexander would be present and would guide their decisions. As long as they stayed before his throne, Eumenes assured them. That's the same bit. And with this astute psychological insight, Eumenes had given his new sub-commanders, the knotty veterans of Alexander's wars, exactly what they needed. They needed their king to come back from the dead. I've done a terrible job with keeping notes on the Kindle, so apologies for that. When I do a highlight, I start highlighting it and then I have to redo it because I do it wrong, and then didn't realise that then when it goes into the notes it duplicates it. So it was really confusing. Anyway, he gets into some sticky situations. There's this amazing bit where he loses a battle, runs away with his army. The other side follow. He doubles back to the battlefield, buries his dead, does all the funereal rites, and then escapes going the other way. Finds this tiny hill fort called Nora. Disbands his army because he won't fit them all in there. There's only enough room there for like 400 people. So they go there, but there's enough provisions in this fort for years. And he decides to lock the door and wait it out. Eventually he has to come out again. And again, there are sticky situations. He's has all these sort of choices to make as to what side he's going to be with and which allegiances he's going to make. But yeah, eventually it doesn't go well for him, and the empire is sort of split. And even after the book, he mentions that there are further civil wars after that there's just not room in this book to go into. So it was really, really fascinating. It was confusing because there are a lot of people with the same name or similar names. Well, I think I'll read a few other things around this, and then maybe in a few years I'll reread this. But it was really, really good. So I would recommend A Ghost on the Throne by James Romm. Sorry, just had to pause to cough because just getting over a cold. And then there's one more book that I finished, and that's The Conference of the Birds by Farid Attar, or there's another title I saw of this on Goodreads or something. I can't remember what it was. This is an allegory, essentially about finding God or the universal, the absolute, told through this pilgrimage that these birds take. The sort of leader that's eventually elected is the hoopoe, who had been used as a messenger by Solomon. And the sort of general pattern is that the other birds bring up some kind of complaint as to why they can't go on this journey, or why they're afraid of this journey, or something like that. And then there'll be a rebuttal from the hoopoe, and then he'll also tell a story from, sort of presumably from Arab or from sort of pan Middle Eastern culture that somehow ties in to that theme. And it was okay, but I wasn't completely convinced, and I don't know. I found the hoopoe a bit annoying, if I'm being terribly honest. I think it's because just the idea of what they're looking for. So it's the idea of the I think it's the shamrock or something like that is what they're calling their king. Their idea of a leader who's the sort of allegory for God or the absolute in this. To go down this path, the whole pilgrimage is the path of Sufism. You have to lose the self, and it's this whole idea of losing the self, and through the various complaints and quibbles of the other birds, you're seeing many genuine fears, many genuine vices of humankind. You're never presented with any of the positives of the self and of individuality, which is all being stripped away in a sense. I found that interesting and a little strange, and then the ending itself being a little anticlimactic as well, to sort of spoil it, being that the Shimorg is kind of themselves, or kind of they are a piece of it. And again, I was a little confused. How can you be stripping yourself of yourself only to find yourself? What's the point? Is there really any real transcendence there? What's going on? So as you can tell, I wasn't convinced. Some of the writing was lovely. Some of the stories were entertaining, but there was this one bit I thought I'd read you, with this one bird who's afraid of dying. So I'll go through a little bit. Another bird spoke up. The way is long, and I am neither valiant nor strong. I'm terrified of death. I know that I, before the first stage is complete, must die. I tremble at the thought. When death draws near, I know I'll shriek and groan in snivelling fear. Whoever fights death with his sword will meet inevitable, absolute defeat. His sword and hand lie smashed. Alas, what grief they grasp who grasp the sword as their belief. The hoopoe said, How feebly you complain! How long will this worn bag of bones remain? What are you but a few bones? And at heart each bone is soft and hastens to depart. Aren't you aware that life, from birth to death, is little more than one precarious breath? That all who suffer birth must also die, their being scattered to the windy sky. As you are reared to live, so from your birth you're also reared to one day leave this earth. The sky is like some huge inverted bowl, which sunset fills with blood from pole to pole. The sun seems then an executioner, beheading thousands with his scimitar. If you are profligate, if you are pure, you are but water mixed with dust, no more. A drop of trembling instability, and can a drop resist the surging sea? Though in the world you were a king, you must, in sorrow and despair, return to dust. And then it goes on to tell a few stories that link in with that idea of the inevitability of death. There's no comfort there at all for this little bird who's afraid of dying, other than, the only explanation, the only answer that we seem to be able to give. But he's saying it's all in the context of the way, that this bird is afraid that he's going to die on the way to the Shimog. That's his fear. The Hoopoe never says why the Shimog is better or more powerful than the fear of death, or why there's anything to be desired that can counterweight that fear. Maybe that's something you'd want to hear. And instead, it's still all in that vein of everything in this life just not being worth it, and being something to shed off, which includes the self. And with this sort of starting point of trying to lose the self, you then find this line, where is it, that all who suffer birth must also die, which, if in another poem in a totally different context, I would find lovely, the idea of suffering birth. But in that context, that feels like such an ugly thing to say, to suffer birth and then you also die. That how terrible is it that we're here in this world? And so I found it, and I think that's the thing, that there was little pleasure there, and maybe you're not supposed to find much pleasure in the pages of a religious allergy. Allergy? Maybe I'm allergic to Sufism. However, as you could hear, the poetry is beautiful. I did find a lot of it very entertaining. And again, now I know the general direction of it and the tone of it, it's going to go back on the shelf, and I will be reading it again at some point in the future, because I do think it warrants rethinking, revisiting, and certainly you don't have to agree with it or be convinced by it to enjoy it. And so it may grow in my estimation, at least aesthetically, with a few rereads. So there we go. That's everything that I've finished so far in March. I've been working away at a few things. Excuse me. My main book for March has been the Strudlhoff Steps by Heimito von Doderer. I've got a fair bit to go and about a week to read all of that, so we'll see how I do. But I've also picked up these English ballads, these early ballads from Bell's English poets, which have been a lot of fun and a nice counterweight to some of the other things I've been reading. But also, I suppose maybe partly inspired by A Ghost on the Throne, although I'm only noticing that now. I want to stay in that general Mediterranean, pan-Macedonian kind of world. And so, although it's of a very different time, but still looking back to that, I think, I decided to reread the selected poems of C.P. Cavafy. So I've only just started dipping back in. but it's been lovely, and I love C.P. Cavafy. I need to get the Mendelssohn translation. I'll get the big Mendelssohn collected Cavafy at some point, but for now I'm doing my best with this one by Avi Sharon. So there we go, that's how things are going at the moment. I hope you're doing well, and that you've had a good week, and that you have a lovely weekend. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.